The snow had been falling for hours by the time I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine, and they weren't Len's. They cut across the back porch of the lodge a neat line of impressions leading away from the guest wing toward the woods. No one had checked out that morning, and no one was supposed to be outside at 2 below zero. The strangest thing was how clean they looked, each step pressed sharply into the powder, as if whoever made them wasn't weighed down at all. I remember standing there staring at the dark line of trees, realizing the steps simply stopped halfway across the yard. No turn, no return path, just gone. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever stayed somewhere that didn't quite feel right. And if these late-night stories keep you company, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. My name is Dana Ellis. I was 37 when this happened, working nights at a mountain lodge in Colorado. These days, I'm 56 and long retired, but back then I was responsible for front desk duties after the evening staff went home. The lodge was small, tucked against the slope of a quiet ski town. Most winters were peaceful, a steady rhythm of checking in families, keeping the fire going and making sure the generator held during storms. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I used to think the snow made the place feel safer, almost protective. That illusion cracked one February night in ways I still can't explain. It started during one of those long storms that sweep across the Rockies without warning. The kind where daylight fades by 4 and the highway out front becomes little more than a suggestion beneath the drifts. Only 3 rooms were occupied that week, and by evening 2 of them had gone dark, the families tucked in early after long days on the slopes. Around 9, the wind picked up rattling the shutters in a way that made the lodge groan like an old ship. I was behind the desk, sipping weak coffee when the door pushed open and a man stepped inside. He didn't track in much snow, which was odd given how heavy it was falling. His coat was dark plain, no patches or logos, and his hat was pulled low. He asked for a room in a voice so soft I had to lean closer to catch the words. No small talk, no mention of the weather or the road, just a quiet request and cash laid neatly on the counter. I glanced at the register, then at him, and noticed his hands bare despite the cold outside. I slid him the key to room 6. He nodded once and walked down the hall without looking back. Len Turner, our overnight maintenance man, wandered into the lobby a little later. He was carrying his tool belt, saying he'd heard the new guest slam a door hard enough to shake the pipes. I mentioned how little the man had said how strange it was that he hadn't signed the register. Len frowned but shrugged it off, muttering that travelers acted all kinds of ways when the weather turned. We both let it go, though I caught him watching the hallway longer than usual before heading to the boiler room. By midnight, the storm was howling. I made my rounds, checking locks, turning down lights, and paused outside room 6. No sound came from inside. No television, no movement, nothing at all. The door handle was cold to the touch, colder than the others along that hall, and for reasons I still don't understand, I leaned in. That's when I heard it. Not footsteps, not breathing, but a faint humming, low and steady like someone singing a single note just under their breath. I told myself it was nothing, that I was tired, and went back to the desk. Still, the humming clung to me. Around 1, I brewed another pot of coffee and noticed Len hadn't come back from his usual rounds. I found him near the rear exit, standing by the glass doors that opened onto the porch. He didn't turn when I called his name. He just pointed outside. That's when I saw the footprints. They were fresh, crisp edges leading away from the door and across the yard, toward the tree line. The problem was the snow had been falling steady all night. If the prints were from earlier, they would have softened or filled in, but these looked untouched, as if laid only moments before. I asked Len if he'd seen anyone leave. He shook his head slowly. We both looked back toward the hall, and without needing to say it, we knew they had to belong to the quiet man in room 6. I returned to check the register again, hoping I'd overlooked something. There was no name written down, no ID, nothing at all, to tie him to the lodge. Just the key missing from its hook, and the faint smell of cold air lingering near the hallway. Len suggested knocking on his door, but when we walked back down the room, stood silent. I pressed my ear against the wood. The humming had stopped. We waited another hour, telling ourselves he'd gone for a smoke or stepped outside despite the cold. But the prints never returned. They ended halfway across the yard, vanishing into untouched snow. Len searched with a flashlight until the wind grew too sharp to stand. When we finally opened the door to room 6, it was empty. The bed was neatly made, and the key rested on the nightstand. No luggage, no coat, not a single sign anyone had been there at all. That night taught me something I never wanted to learn, that silence can be heavier than sound, and that sometimes a man checks in only, to leave behind a trail that goes nowhere. I don't usually talk about this. It was the kind of thing that made me question my own instincts, and I worked nights long enough to know when something isn't right. Back in 2019, I was the overnight manager at a regional distribution warehouse in Allentown. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me a rhythm I'd grown used to. Nights were quiet after the trucks pulled out. My crew was small, maybe 5 people on shift, and most hours I spent in the front office with the monitors humming and the security feeds flickering in black and white. I'd worked that job for almost a decade, and nothing much ever changed. Until we hired Wesley. He was mid-20s, soft-spoken, and showed up in pressed clothes that looked out of place among the rest of us in work boots and hoodies. Said he'd moved from out west, didn't specify where. His references checked out just enough to get him in the door, though later I'd wonder if anyone ever really verified them. From the first night, I noticed he walked the aisles differently. Everyone else cut through the same paths between racks, but he kept drifting into darker corners where we rarely went. When I asked him once what he was looking for, he said he was just getting a feel for the place. His tone was polite, but there was something about the way his eyes lingered that put me off. The warehouse at night could already play tricks on you. The highlights buzzed faintly, and shadows stretched longer than they should. On winter nights, the heating ducts groaned, echoing down the rows of pallets. I'd learned to tune it out. But the first week Wesley was there, I started noticing little things I couldn't explain. One night around 2 in the morning, I heard a metal door slam somewhere near the loading bays. When I checked, every door was locked from the inside, chains intact, but Wesley was standing there in the middle of the floor. He wasn't holding anything, wasn't working on any task. He just said he'd heard it too and thought he'd check. Another time I pulled up the camera feeds and saw him on the east mezzanine standing perfectly still for nearly 10 minutes. No clipboard, no scanner, just motionless with his hands at his sides staring down into the racks. When I asked him about it the next day, he laughed softly and said the cameras must have glitched. By his third week, some of the others started avoiding him. One of the forklift guys told me Wesley had been asking odd questions about which exits stayed unlocked, how many people were on duty in the far wings, and whether the security guard did full rounds or just partial checks. I tried to dismiss it as nervousness from being the new guy, but a part of me couldn't shake the thought that he was studying us, like we were part of a pattern he was trying to learn. The night everything came to a head was late February. A cold snap had frozen the pipes near the north wall, and most of the crew left early, after the main shipments went out. Just me, Wesley, and one forklift driver stayed behind. Around 3 a.m., I noticed the forklift had been parked with the keys still in it, which wasn't like the operator at all. His jacket was draped across the seat, but he was nowhere in sight. I checked the bathrooms. Empty. I checked the break room. Lights off, untouched. His car was still in the lot, parked in the same space he always used. That's when I saw Wesley on the monitor. He was in the back wing where we kept surplus inventory, a section no one needed to be in that night. The camera caught him crouched between two pallets, his face tilted upward like he was listening for something above. I walked out there, the sound of my boots echoing on the concrete. The section was colder than the rest of the building, the lights buzzing overhead. I called his name. He stood up slowly, smoothed his shirt, and asked if I needed something. His tone was calm, but he looked flushed, like I'd interrupted something. I asked if he'd seen the forklift operator. He said no, not tonight, and then he smiled faintly, the kind of smile you give when you're holding back the rest of a thought. Something in me tightened. I told him to head back toward the office, that I'd finish the rounds alone. He hesitated before walking past me, his shoes silent on the floor. When I returned to the monitors, Wesley wasn't in the office. He wasn't on any camera feed either. I rewound the footage, scanning for him, and caught a glimpse of his jacket slipping into a blind spot between bays 4 and 5. The forklift operator never reappeared. By dawn, I called the police. Officer Brewster was the one who came, a heavy-set man I'd known since high school. He walked the aisles with me, checked every door, even searched the mezzanine. No sign of either of them. Brewster shrugged, said maybe the forklift guy had gone home sick and forgot to clock out, though his car remained in the lot until afternoon, when his brother came to pick it up. Wesley never came back. His number was disconnected within days. The staffing agency claimed he'd never been on their roster. Even the paperwork we'd filed on his first day had vanished from the cabinet, the space where his folder should have been left completely empty. The forklift driver was reported missing by his family. Last I heard, the case was still open. His jacket, though, I still remember the smell of diesel and the shape of the key ring inside the pocket. They'd both been left behind. When I think back on it, what unsettles me most isn't just that Wesley vanished or that one of my crew disappeared the same night. It's how carefully Wesley had studied us in the weeks before. He'd mapped the place, learned the patterns, and then walked away without leaving a single trace of who he was. I grew up around truck stops, but there's one night that stayed with me more than any other, and it happened at a place I never planned to visit. In the summer of 2007, I was 52 and hauling produce from Illinois out toward Wyoming. Most of my routes were predictable, but that night, heavy storms had closed parts of the interstate near Lincoln, forcing me to detour west on older stretches of I-80. Those roads felt emptier, the kind of places where gas stations close by 10 and the dark outpaces your headlights. I'd been driving since dawn and pulled into a rest stop just outside North Platte to stretch my legs. The place was small. One row of parking spaces, a picnic shelter, and a bathroom building with that familiar, humming fluorescent light. I remember the air smelled like wet grass from the earlier rain, and there was a steady drone of insects in the trees behind the lot. Only 2 other rigs were parked there. One belonged to Ray, a driver I knew from years on the circuit. We'd crossed paths a dozen times, before mostly swapping stories over burnt coffee. I waved and he lifted a thermos in return before settling back into his cab. What made that stop unusual was the old phone booth standing off to the side near the tree line. Most of those booths had been ripped out by then, but this one leaned slightly, its glass fogged and streaked the metal frame dulled by rust. At first, I didn't pay it much mind, though. Something about its presence in the glow of the sodium light looked out of step with the rest of the stop. I used the restroom, filled my thermos from the water fountain, and came back out into the warm night. That's when I noticed a man standing in the booth. I hadn't seen him arrive, and I hadn't heard a car pull up. He was tall and thin, wearing a pale jacket that seemed too light for the weather, and he stood with the door propped open, holding the receiver to his ear. I thought maybe he was using a calling card or trying to reach someone the old way, but the longer I watched, the more it didn't make sense. The booth wasn't wired. I knew because Ray and I had laughed earlier in the year about how those relics dotted the highway, but had long since gone dead. I even remembered this exact booth from years back, the line clipped and the phone disconnected. Yet the man stood there as if he was listening intently, nodding once in a while, his free hand resting against the glass. I tried not to stare, but the sight unsettled me. After a few minutes, I climbed back into my rig and checked my logbook. That's when I noticed Ray standing outside his cab, now looking toward the booth too. He met my eyes across the lot, and though we didn't speak, I knew he felt it as well, that something about this scene was off. The man never seemed to speak. He only listened. At one point, he pressed his forehead against the glass as though the words were heavy and he had to lean into them. Then slowly he closed the door of the booth behind him. The interior light flickered weakly, and in that faint glow I saw his lips moving, but no sound carried. I stepped down from my cab and walked halfway across the lot, pretending to check my trailer straps. From that angle, I could hear the faint rattle of the phone cord tapping against the metal. The man's posture didn't change, but I caught fragments of his expression through the fogged glass, wide, almost eager eyes and a smile that didn't quite fit. Ray muttered something when I passed him a quiet, "You see this too?" I nodded. Neither of us moved closer. We both stood there in the stillness of the rest stop, the hum of insects surrounding us, the booth standing like a cage of glass and light. After what must have been 15 minutes, the man placed the receiver back on the hook, though I never once heard a dial tone. He opened the door and stepped out without looking toward us. Instead of walking to a car, he moved across the lot and into the tree line. No headlights flicked on, no engine started, nothing at all to mark his leaving. Just the sound of branches snapping briefly, and then silence. Ray and I walked to the booth together. Inside, the receiver dangled slightly swaying, as if it had only just been released. I lifted it to my ear, expecting nothing, but there was a faint noise on the line. Not static, not the dead hum of a disconnected phone. Something softer, like breathing. I set it back down quickly and stepped out into the night air. Ray said we should let it go, and I agreed. We both climbed back into our cabs and pretended to sleep until dawn engines idling low. When daylight came, the booth stood empty, streaked with condensation, the phone resting still against the cradle. I passed that rest stop dozens of times in the years after, and the booth was always there, tilted and unused, no light inside the cord cut clean. But I can't shake the memory of that man listening in the dark, nodding to words only he could hear, before disappearing into trees that didn't lead anywhere. I grew up learning to trust my instincts, but one night proved to me that sometimes your instincts are the only thing standing between you and something you'll never understand. In 1996, I was 28 and working night shifts at Salem General Hospital. The job was demanding, and to keep myself steady, I developed the habit of running after work. The quiet hours before dawn gave me time to think, and the cool air cleared away the heaviness of the ward. My coworker Lydia sometimes joined me, but more often than not, it was just me, the river trail, and the low glow of the street lamps. That November, the fog came early. It was the kind of dense Oregon fog that settles low and thick, muting every sound and making the familiar path feel like a tunnel with no end. I remember how it clung to my clothes, turning the light from the lamps into faint circles that dissolved as soon as you stepped past them. Even my own footsteps sounded muffled, as if the air itself was swallowing them. I started my run around 3 in the morning, the trail slick with fallen leaves, and the river just a dark line of motion on my left. About 10 minutes in, I noticed something faint beneath the hum of the city, a sound that didn't fit. At first, I thought it was someone humming, just a few notes rising and falling in rhythm with my pace. But when I slowed down, the sound continued steady, coming from somewhere ahead. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe another early runner, maybe a radio left on by one of the houses near the bend. Still, as I rounded the curve, I saw her. A woman standing barefoot on the trail, her nightgown hanging torn at the hem, the fabric clinging damp against her legs. She held something in her hand, and even in the fog, I saw how her fingers curled around it tightly, as though it were precious. When I came closer, I realized what it was. A finger. A man's finger, pale and rigid with a gold wedding band still fixed around it. I stopped without meaning to my breath, clouding the air in front of me. The woman's eyes flicked toward me, and her humming faltered into words I couldn't quite catch. Something about looking under the floorboards, something about what he had taken from her. I asked if she needed help, my voice sounding too loud in the fog. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she lifted the severed finger higher, like she wanted me to see it clearly, then whispered, "He hid them all." Her gaze wasn't fixed on me, but past me as though she saw something moving in the mist behind my shoulder. The air felt heavier the longer I stood there, like the fog was pressing in against both of us. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Finally, I heard the distant wail of a siren approaching, faint but cutting through the night. The woman flinched, dropped her arm to her side, and without another word slipped into the fog toward the riverbank. I tried to follow, but within 3 steps she was gone. No splashing, no footsteps, nothing, just silence. 2 patrol cars arrived minutes later, lights flashing faintly through the mist. The officers asked what I'd seen, and I tried to explain the nightgown, the finger, the way she whispered about floorboards. They searched the area, but found nothing. One officer shined his flashlight down near the bank and turned up only a set of footprints pressed faintly into the wet soil, leading nowhere. Later that morning, when I came off shift at the hospital, the news reached us quickly. A woman from the psychiatric ward had escaped through a maintenance door just after midnight. She'd attacked her husband before fleeing. He survived, but with several fingers missing and deep wounds that kept him in surgery for hours. Her name wasn't given to me then, and I didn't ask. I still run when I can, though never again on fog-heavy nights. Sometimes when the mist rolls in from the river, I hear faint humming behind me, so soft I can't be certain it's there. But I always remember the way she lifted that finger like an object of truth, and the way she disappeared into air so thick it should have revealed every step. The last real job I had before moving north was with the county survey office, and one night out on a rural stretch of road changed the way I see empty highways. It was the summer of 2004, humid, and still the air thick with the smell of pine and wet earth. I was 35, working long weeks, checking road conditions in the back country of West Virginia. Most evenings I came home before dark, but sometimes the schedule pushed me later. That particular night I'd stopped near the foothills about 15 miles from the nearest town to mark a damaged culvert where a creek had overflowed earlier in the week. By the time I finished recording notes and measurements, the sun had dipped behind the ridges, leaving the sky a deep violet. The 2-lane road was quiet, except for the faint rattle of cicadas. I was climbing back into my county-issued truck when I noticed a car pulled onto the shoulder about 100 yards ahead. Its hazard lights blinked in the gloom, flashing weak amber against the trees. At first, I assumed it was just another stranded driver, maybe someone with a flat. But as I rolled closer, something about the scene unsettled me. The car was older, a silver sedan with fading paint parked at a strange angle, with the front wheels turned slightly into the ditch. The driver's door hung open, and the dome light inside cast a pale glow over the empty front seat. I slowed, stopped my truck behind it, and called out. No answer. The only sound was the click of the hazards and the drone of insects rising from the tall grass. I stepped out my boots, crunching gravel, and checked the car. The engine was off, but the keys dangled from the ignition. A half-empty coffee cup sat in the holder, still warm when I touched it. I walked around to the rear and found a license plate streaked with mud, the numbers almost obscured. The trunk was locked, the back seat empty, a thin blanket crumpled on the floorboards. What struck me most was the silence, no footsteps in the grass, no voices, nothing to explain where the driver had gone. I radioed the sheriff's office and waited. Sheriff Alden himself pulled up 20 minutes later, his cruiser lights washing the trees in red and blue. He was a steady man, one I'd known since school, and he frowned as he looked over the car. Together we searched the shoulder, the ditch, and a narrow path that cut into the woods. We called out our voices, fading quickly into the stillness. The sheriff ran the plates while I stood by the open door, the hazards still ticking. After a few minutes he came back, shaking his head. The car was registered to a woman in another county, reported sold 3 years earlier. No active record, no insurance on file, nothing current at all. We towed it to the impound lot that night, but the image of it sitting there on the shoulder stayed with me. The warm coffee, the keys. Left in place, the door open like the driver had only stepped out for a moment. A week later, I stopped by the lot during lunch to look at it again. The sedan sat among a row of wrecks, its hazard lights finally drained dead. But when I opened the door, the cup holder was empty. The blanket in the back was gone. The ignition key remained, but the seat was pushed back farther, as though someone taller had been sitting there. The sheriff told me not to worry, that it was probably just a clerical mix-up or one of his deputies moving things around. But when I asked which deputy, he changed the subject. The car was removed from the lot within days, no record of where it had gone. I still drive those roads sometimes when visiting family, and I always glance at that stretch of shoulder. Even years later, I find myself expecting to see that silver sedan again, parked with its hazards blinking in the dusk, waiting for someone who never comes back. I spent a good part of my 40s on the road, and most of the places I stayed at blurred together into the same anonymous pattern of faded carpet humming ice machines and buzzing fluorescent signs. One particular inn, tucked off a state highway near Hannibal, Missouri, never blended in with the rest. I only stayed there once, but it's the kind of memory that presses itself into the quiet hours, when the house is dark, reminding me that some places hold on to people in ways you can't explain. It was late autumn in 2011, the sky heavy with rain that never seemed to stop. I'd been driving since dawn, my windshield wipers scraping against the glass for hours, and by the time I saw the inn's flickering roadside sign, I was too tired to care about anything but a bed. The place had the look of another era, with a sagging roofline peeling white paint and curtains that hung like shadows behind each window. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of mothballs and wood polish. The woman at the front desk introduced herself as Margaret. She was small, elderly, and dressed neatly as though expecting someone far more important than a weary salesman. I asked for a room, and she hesitated before offering me one near the back. She slid the key across the counter but warned me almost apologetically that some guests found it uncomfortable. I asked what she meant, and she just said certain rooms seemed lonelier than others, as if the walls remembered too much. I laughed it off, but her face didn't change. The room itself looked ordinary enough. 2 beds, both made with stiff sheets, a lamp with a crooked shade, and an old television balanced on a dresser. The only odd thing was the mirror on the far wall. It wasn't mounted like a decoration, but seemed built into the plaster, the glass framed by cracked molding that looked as old as the inn itself. At first, nothing felt wrong. I set my suitcase down, kicked off my shoes, and turned on the TV to drown out the patter of rain against the window. But after a while, I began to notice the timing of things. Each time I glanced toward the mirror, the reflection of the room felt a heartbeat out of step, as though the gestures and movements lagged by the smallest fraction of a second. I told myself it was exhaustion, that my eyes were playing tricks after a long day. But when I switched off the lamp to sleep, the sense of being watched grew sharper. Lying there in the dark, I heard the faintest scrape like a fingernail against glass. It came from the direction of the mirror, steady and patient. I got up, turned on the light, and the sound stopped. The room looked ordinary again. The reflection lined up perfectly, as though nothing had ever been wrong. I thought about calling Margaret to ask for another room, but pride or weariness kept me from it. Instead, I left the light on and drifted in and out of shallow sleep. Sometime after 3 in the morning, I woke with a start. The rain had stopped, and the silence was so complete it rang in my ears. My eyes went to the mirror automatically. For a moment, I thought I was still dreaming. Someone stood in the reflection between the 2 beds, a man tall and gaunt, his face turned toward me. In the real room, the space was empty, but in the mirror he remained, his outline blurred like a shadow behind glass. I sat frozen, unable to look away. He didn't move, didn't blink, only stood with his hands hanging stiffly at his sides. Then slowly he raised one hand and pressed it flat against the glass, leaving no mark I could see, but the gesture was deliberate, almost patient. I fumbled for the lamp, but before my fingers found the switch, the reflection aligned again, and the space behind me was just an empty room with 2 beds. At dawn, I packed my bag and left the key on the desk without a word. Margaret looked at me with something like understanding, though she never asked what I'd seen. I drove away and never returned to that stretch of highway. Yet even now, on quiet nights, I think of that mirror and the man who waited just out of step with time, raising his hand as if he knew I'd be watching. That was one of those memories I've never been able to shake, and telling it now, it feels connected in ways I don't fully understand to all the other strange encounters I've carried with me. Looking back on each story, they all share something: empty spaces that didn't feel empty, people who seemed to appear from nowhere, places that looked like they were waiting for someone to return. None of them offered answers, only glimpses of something just outside the ordinary rhythm of life. I sometimes wonder if the roads we travel, the inns we stay at, and the quiet towns we pass through hold onto fragments of the people who were there before us. Maybe it's nothing more than fatigue, timing, and imagination. Or maybe those moments are reminders that we're never as alone as we think we are, especially in the places meant only for passing through. As I think about these stories together, I'm left with the quiet certainty that unease often hides in the most ordinary details: a stalled car, a locked room, a mirror that lingers a moment too long. Those are the memories that stay with you long after the lights go out. Thank you for staying with me through the end of these stories. If you'd like to hear more nights like this, please subscribe, share the channel, and join me again for the next one. And tell me, have you ever found yourself in a place that seemed perfectly ordinary, yet left you unsettled in a way you still can't explain?